something special is found in the black mica specks in granite rock. We've gone over this a little bit so far, but these black granite specks in the granite rock is something that we've said thus far already holds a mystery, a real mystery, of course, that is going to affect a lot of people before it's all over. We were talking about that thus far. And this evidence that we have discussed thus far is in the microscope, seen under the microscope in these black mica specks there in the granite rock. And David, again, we want to make sure we're all on the same page. What is that?
It's a polonium-218 halo. So we have a 3-ring halo, polonium-218 halo, an isotope of, it has a 3-minute half-life. And the idea is very simple. Like we said last night, if you have a molten rock and you have a theory of granite formation where that rock cools slowly over millions of years, you cannot have that theory and primordial polonium halos. It's that simple. Why? Because if you have primordial polonium halos implanted, the radio centers from that primordial polonium implanted in the rock at the time the rock formed from a melt, by the time the rock cools and crystallizes millions of years later, you've gone way past the 3 minutes or so that the half-life of polonium-18 exists, and you have no record of that halo left in the rock. So the only conclusion you can come up to, if that doesn't work, is to say that that is not primordial polonium, that must be polonium derived from uranium, the uranium decay series. So that is the method, or that is the strategy that most people that do not agree with the polonium halos utilize in their arguments to say that this does not make any sense. They say, well, it must have a secondary source. It has to, because if it doesn't, my whole theory of the age of the Earth, or the Earth formation or granite formation, all goes down the drain.
David, you know, we've talked a lot about primordial. That means made in the beginning, doesn't it? That's what primordial means.
Made in the beginning.
Made in the beginning. And so what we're talking about is something that had to be made in the beginning. Let's continue. Remember we had this schematic last night where we're talking about something that had a little speck of radioactivity there in the center, and it ejects particles, just microscopic distances in a piece of mica. And as a result of that, just like sun's rays, of course, will bleach objects, colored objects, the radiation from the little tiny speck there will discolor the region around that little tiny speck and produces then a halo. You can see it's three-dimensional. The little particles go out in all directions. But the particles themselves shooting out from that center, 3 different kinds of particles, originate with a kind of radioactivity that exists for only a short period of time. And that short period of time is associated with primordial radioactivity. And as we sort of review basically what we've come up to make sure we're all on the same page, we have a whole series of these polonium halos. Polonium, of course, is simply a chemical element, but it's radioactive. But it has only a short half-life. It exists for only a short period of time, and then it's gone. And we had this summary slide last night, and David, tell us about the top and then about the bottom of that schematic that we have there to make sure we're all on the same page.
Right. This slide basically just reiterates what we've already said. The top half reiterates what the evolutionary model would predict. If you have slowly cooling granite over long periods of time, you would not have radio halos, because the activity would have decayed long before the record could be left in the rock. If you do have a model of creation where God places the polonium in the rocks, creates the rock with polonium in situ, polonium there already, so that it's leaving a record immediately after the rock has been created, then you have a model which at least fits what we see in the field, what we see under the microscope.
It's important that we understand that what we're dealing with here is something observational. It's not theory. We're seeing these halos in granites all over the world. Primordial polonium halos conflict with what geologists believe about the origin of granite. But we will now see they themselves are barely confused about what they believe. In other words, geologists themselves have said granite forms slowly deep in the earth over a long, long period of time. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I mentioned earlier last night that if you take a geology class, you will learn very quickly that the textbook has a very definite definition of how granite forms. But if you look into it a little bit deeper, you actually see that geologists themselves have varying opinions on how granite forms. And for the reasons why is because you do not see active granite formation. In fact, back in 1947, there was actually a conference that was focusing on the origin of granite. How did granite form? And in this conference...
I just want to add to what you're saying here. We think it would be well for the viewers, audience, to know that indeed, of all things, geologists have been thinking about the origin of granite in the 1800s. They had seen all these granite rocks like El Capitan and others around the world, but they didn't know where the granite came from. Whereas, you know, if you have a volcanic eruption, it erupts and you see the rocks form, that's visual. You know where those rocks came from. But the geologists could not find a place where granite was forming. Isn't that true?
That's right.
They couldn't find that. So they had all these granite rocks all over the world, but they didn't know where they came from. So they had to invent. That's really the word they did. They invented the idea that the granites must have formed, isn't it true, out of sight.
Right.
And so out of sight, they figured, well, at one time it was hot down in the earth, well, really, really, really hot. We know it is hot down there further on. But there was a huge melt, and gradually over a period of time, it what? Cooled and went to a solid. Now, though, David, we're going to find out how well do they really know what they were talking about. You were going ahead.
Let's look at the next slide here. This is actually a quote from F. Fitz Osborne, I think is what the next slide is going to say. But anyway, in this quote, he says, "Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to take a part in a discussion of this sort for two reasons. In the first place, the newspapers and the radio are bringing problems before us every day, and they are threatening dire consequences if we do not solve them. In this symposium, we are treating a problem that is really an old friend. This problem goes back through almost all the years during which there has been a science of geology. We have never satisfied ourselves as to the solution, and we furthermore must note that no very serious consequences arise if we do not arrive at that solution." F. Fitz Osborne. What is that problem that is really an old friend? The problem is, how did granite form? And I mentioned briefly last night, there's another quote, we can go ahead and look at that too, that we're saying, you know, if granite formed naturally, you should be able to form it in the laboratory today. Well, people say, well, wait a minute. We're theorizing that granite forms slowly over millions of years. How could we ever devise a laboratory experiment that would last millions of years for the granite to slowly cool? And I'll give you a chance to think about that a little bit more. We'll talk about it when we show a slide later that actually shows a result from an experiment where granite was attempted to be synthesized in the laboratory. A.E.J. Engel, U.S. Geological Survey, said this: "The appeal has been made repeatedly for an objective approach to the problem of origin of granite." The problem is the origin of granite, with careful and restrained use of the attractive hypotheses. But they're not susceptible to proof. Why are they not susceptible to proof? Because you can't actually see the granite forming. It's miles underneath the Earth's surface. If exposed to continued testing, that's an important point in science. You have to test your views. Our points of view, like whiskey, will doubtless change and improve with age.
David,
that's the hope.
David, we want to remind ourselves and everyone, of course, this was an origin of granite symposium, I believe, held in 1947. And geologists have been thinking about the origin of granite for 150 years. But here in 1947, they were saying these things to one another. They're basically admitting, not realizing that later on we were going to find what they say and bring it out here tonight, how uncertain they were at that time. Have things changed at all? 1947. A lot of things have happened in the last 50 or more years. Let's see what else is going to happen. Well, now, there's another one here, says it was taking place in 1988. What happened?
Right. So a little more recently, the 1947, 1988, there was another conference on the origin of granite. And a quote here by Professor W.S. Fife from the University of Western Ontario says, as was well documented by the discussion during this meeting, many, old questions are still debated. But I think we now have the tools to resolve many of the basic questions. I would certainly hope that 100 years hence, we will not be debating the origins of granite. The thing we're really trying to stress here and get across that we're coming up here and proposing a very radical idea. And that idea is that granite rock was part of the original created rock. You know, from a scientific point of view, that doesn't make any sense. You don't make scientific hypotheses based on something being created by God. That's something that's out of the realm of science. That's something that's in the realm of religion. But just hold on for a minute. Look at what the scientists say themselves about the origin of granite. They don't even know how really it formed. It's a mystery. And in fact, when you actually do the experiment to test whether the theory of granite formation actually works in the laboratory, it comes up far short of a granite. You actually come up with a rock that's called a rhyolite. But we'll look at that when we get to it. But go ahead and
David,
keep going here. And
we're talking about some exciting things. We're talking about something that basically overthrows a major discipline of science, of geology, that thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of geologists have believed, and millions of scientists in the world still believe it. And we're standing up here tonight and saying, indeed, fellas, you've got it all wrong. Look at that last sentence there. This man, Professor W. Fife, the last statement says, I would certainly hope that 100 years hence we will not be debating the origins of granite. Does that sound like to you that he's really got a realistic expectation that they're going to be able to explain
I don't
it?
think so.
Can you imagine if the people in the world really understood, even the science students, geologists going through the curriculum, really understood the tremendous uncertainties of what they learn in the classroom about the origin of granite, the origin of the earth, and going along with that, the age of the earth, and not only the age of the earth, the age of the cosmos. We're dealing with material here tonight, with ideas, with scientific data and the Bible, that literally, if understood, and that's why we're here tonight, to help people understand and get it out to the world, this is going to revolutionize. I'm not ashamed to say that in God's great providence it is going to happen, and there's going to be a revolution of some sorts. So we better be prepared. Anyway, that was back in 1988 where that symposium was occurring. But you know, the geologists didn't stop trying to explain granites at that time. Guess what happened?
Let me have that clicker.
Anyway, I'm getting carried away, aren't I? That's okay. Several years later, in the 90s, there was another symposium. Really, really thick. Thousands of experiments are being done. And again, Fourth Hutton Symposium on the origin of granite. No granite forming. Thousands of pages again. Then we've got another one here in the early 2000s. Fifth Hutton Symposium on the origin of granite and related rocks. Still, thousands of geologists are working night and day for years and decades, now a century or more. And still no origin.
But I think it's important to say that when you go to the classroom and to even the college classroom, the idea that there's any kind of argument or uncertainty about the theory of how granite forms is not really conveyed in the textbooks. So the students really aren't getting any of the full picture of, saying, well, hey, there are, a lot of uncertainties about what we really believe here. And honestly, I think that's the same thing that's holding true for not just the theory of granite formation, but for the other classes that are being taught. Classes on evolution, the different types of beliefs in evolution. Why do people believe in evolution? All of the uncertainties that are inherent in those theories aren't being fully disclosed to the students. It's being taught more as a fact. And behind all of these theories, of course, are serious flaws. And of course, behind our hypothesis, behind our belief is, of course, a belief that God is actually doing miraculous he's doing miracles. So even that involves faith. But no matter whether you believe our conclusion about how the polonium halos exist, even if you don't accept our conclusion that they were created by God or they are evidence that God created the rock, you're still left with trying to explain them naturalistically. And that's the key to the whole situation. Even if you don't accept the conclusion of the polonium halos, you have to explain them naturalistically in your own model. And that's really what the problem is.
You know, I'm tempted to go ahead. I'll say something just about on what you said just then, and that is the students who go into the classrooms and they listen. They're listening to people they think do what? Know the truth. And so they absorb what they hear as if it is the truth. Peer pressure.
Well, you know, you're programmed when you go to school to believe that whatever's told from you from the up front is a fact. And 99% of the time, that's true. You know, you go to elementary school, you hear about math, you hear about all the, history, all these things that are, verified, or you can attempt to verify them. Math is a logical thing. So you're used to hearing truth from a teacher. It's all turned around backwards when the teacher's actually trying to tell you something which has not been verified, but they don't disclose to the students that it hasn't been verified. They present it as fact. And that's the thing that is really dangerous, especially the younger the students are, the less they're able to make up their own minds about what they believe, the more danger it is.
David, we've got what the geologists really calculate. In other words, we mentioned, of course, deep in the ground and so forth. They believe that the millions of years it took, of course, for the melt to become solid and so forth. But that means also there was what we call differential melting from the outside in. And so a small piece of melt then should be able to be solidified.
Right. So the argument that says, well, you can't devise an experiment to actually test the theory of formation of granite because you don't have the millions of years. But if you use the principle of differential cooling, you actually do have time to do that type of an experiment. In fact, it only takes a few days or a few weeks at the most. This theory of rapid cooling and formation of a small quantity of granite melt was disproved during the University of Tennessee public presentation on April 13, 1987.
Here we come to what I think is an exciting part of our presentation. Years ago, 1987, as David was saying, April 13, 1987, yours truly was invited to make a presentation on this topic at the University of Tennessee. And here's a view, at least of the audience, that particular evening. A lot of people from the Knoxville area came, as well as students, as well as faculty members. And here's the title, Should Creation Science Be Taught at the University of Tennessee? Well, you know that grabbed some headlines there at the university and got some faculty members all excited about coming in and defending, of course, the university from the teaching of creation science. And it was Monday, April 13, 1987, the UT Alumni Gym, sponsored by the UT chapter of the Society for Creation Science, a chapter that I did not know anything about before they contacted me and asked me if I would make the presentation. I was the guest speaker that night, and there I am speaking. A little bit younger than I am tonight. But in any event, what I was saying at that particular time was what David and I have just been talking about. David can affirm, we've got a videotape of this, it'll be available tomorrow night for anyone who wants it. But David can affirm that indeed I was up there telling the audience, that here I've just got a small piece of granite. Supposedly this would form relatively soon if you tried to duplicate it. And so at that particular time we had a little piece of granite like this I had in my hand, and I was telling the audience, the thing that's wrong with evolution theory of granite formation is that you can't even duplicate something like this in the laboratory. And I said, that proves in itself the whole idea of granite formation is wrong, doesn't come out to be granite at all. And then I next remarked that to produce polonium halos in granite, in other words, if you're going to try to explain these primordial polonium halos naturalistically, that means you've got to be able to duplicate them in the granite rock itself. I was telling them about that. Then I said, the very fact, though, that geologists, no one can actually synthesize a small piece of granite. In other words, you melt it and then let it cool under pressure and temperature and conditions and so forth, that it doesn't really come back to that. That was what I was saying to the audience at that particular time. And at that particular time, I had, as I said, a piece of granite in my hand, and this geology professor speaks out from the audience, said, "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about." And at that point in time, he had a number of geology students there. Do you remember what happened?
They were cheering.
Yeah.
And so when he got up, and when the professor stood up in the back of the audience, and he said, "You know, I'm going to take exception to this," you know, and he comes down, and his students were back there clapping and cheering, and, you know, there was a real air of victory that was about to happen, because the professor of geology was going to come up and say, you know, basically he stood up there and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about when you say you can't synthesize a piece of granite. I do it all the time in my laboratory. I do it, I can do, you know, it happens all the time." But then when he was questioned a little more closely about it, and just for your own FYI here, the full videotape of his talk or his discourse there, or the whole presentation is available still. Unfortunately, the video quality isn't as good as it could have been, but you can still get an idea of the tension that was there that night, because at first, you know, everybody's like really surprised that somebody stood up and challenged, but then, you know, by the time, you know, he stood up and was making these comments, it was apparent that he really believed in what he was saying.
It was a real first-class confrontation. He was right back there, you know, about the end of the auditorium here, and I couldn't hear him. And I said, "Well, come on up to the microphone." And that's what he's done. He's come up to the microphone there. And he said, "What do you mean you can't synthesize granite? What do you mean? There are hundreds of reports in the literature. You're just ignorant. You're ignorant of all these reports. Where have you been?" Type stuff. And so I said, "Well, let me hear what you have to say." And so the more he talked, "Yeah." And I said, "Do you think you can synthesize a piece of granite?" "Yeah." I said, "How long will it take you?" Well, and I had a piece of granite, a small piece of granite in my hand. I said, "Well, come, take a look at this piece." And I walked over to the edge of the stage, and I said, "Come, take a look at it." And so he walked over and looked at it for half a minute or so and gave it back to me. And I said, "How long do you think it will take you to do that?" "About a week." "About a week." David's smiling. He heard him say it. And so I said, "Can we all come back and see it? Can we all come back and see it in a week?"
And he said, no. He goes, my laboratory's not set up to do that. He goes, "But we can go down to Johnson Space Center," or where else did he say? Anyway, it doesn't matter what he said. You can look at the video, but one of them was Johnson Space Center. I just remember that for some reason. And I just thought, why would you go to Johnson Space Center? But anyway, it was good. It was a good illustration of the prevailing scientific belief that, you know, there is really no controversy about the granite formation, and that you really can synthesize a hand-sized piece of granite. But when you really look into the details, it's a lot harder, it's a lot easier said than done. You can't really synthesize the granite. And the implications of that are important.
Well, as we continued, my interchange with the professor here went on for 23 minutes all in all, and again, it's all on the videotape. It's available tomorrow night if you're interested. It's online at www.halos. You don't have to buy anything, and it's all there. But as we progressed, I progressed in discussing this with him. He continued to be affirming that hundreds of reports were in the literature, and I was just ignorant for not knowing about how many times granite had been synthesized, plus the fact that he continued to affirm that indeed he could do it. And so anyway, the issue was joined, so to speak. And finally, I said, you know, I said, if you can do it, I'll give you my telephone number and I'll ask you to call me. And I said, we'll make this not only a citywide, county-wide announcement, we'll make it statewide. We'll make it national television that you, Professor Taylor, have been able to actually synthesize a piece of granite here at the University of Tennessee. Now, at this particular point in time, the applause of the students had gone down a little bit. But I mean, as David said earlier, they were a cheering section. They had planned it, apparently, for him to say something. It was a cheering section for a while. Anyway, the program ended that night. Before that particular program that night, earlier we said, last night, of course, that the National Academy of Sciences, this most eminent of all scientific organizations in the world, had put out a booklet in 1984, and they had said that essentially Genesis had been what? Invalidated. There was nothing to Genesis. And so I wrote a letter to the president of the National Academy of Sciences before our meeting that night and asking him to come and send members of the National Academy of Sciences and show where this evidence was going to be refuted, because it had all been published in the national journals. Anyway, he didn't come, but he wrote a letter, and that letter is a copy of that letter is in the back of my book, if you want to look at it that way. It's all online, halos.com. But anyway, the president, Dr. Frank Press, said, we recognize essentially that you have scientific reports, and these need to be discussed. But in essence, I'm not going to come, I'm not going to send anybody to be with you. We can't agree that one small piece of data, small piece of data, is going to overthrow all the fields of geology, astronomy, biology. It just went on and on and on. And as you have pointed out earlier, that indeed this one little tiny piece of data, though, is what? Worldwide. And it's something where indeed the geologists, the evolutionists of the world, simply want to ignore. They want to bury. Usually when you find something unusual that contrasts or contradicts a known physical theory, scientific theory of any report, the scientists of the world would bring that to the center of scientific attention for analysis, for investigation, to find out what the truth is. But David, what has happened in this case?
Well, we're still going to find out.
We're still going to find. Thus far, they're trying to bury it. Well, anyway, he said he could make granite in a week. Nothing happened. In a week, nothing. 6 months later, nothing happened. I wrote to the geology department chairman, and I said, Dr. Taylor has said he promised he would give me a piece of granite in a week, or at least would provide me with one of these hundreds of reports on granite synthesis, but there was no reply. 22 years and more now tonight, there's still no granite synthesis. And so after he spoke, after that 23-minute exchange, I said, well, listen, there's something really important. I'm so happy you came forward tonight, because here's the situation. Geologists have claimed that indeed they have synthesized granite in the laboratory. That was a claim. Someone had indicated that to me many, many times. And so I investigated that claim. It was something that was done at the University of Pennsylvania way back in the 1960s, and a geologist there had actually taken a small piece of granite and put it in a platinum envelope and sealed it up, heated it up to 900 degrees centigrade, and then let it cool very, very, very slowly over several weeks. Now, those are the exact conditions you expect to have granite form experimentally. Well, it turns out that he had all that photographed. In other words, there was a motion picture made of this experiment in University of Pennsylvania way back in the 1960s. And then there was a time where indeed the experiment was over, and the platinum envelope was opened, and the piece of rock came out. Now, I, through God's great providence, was able to track down that particular piece of rock. Decades earlier, the geologists who had done it, by my request, went back, and my belief is that the Lord helped him to find that piece of rock, and he sent it to me. Well, I had it that night at the University of Tennessee, and I contrasted. Here's what happens in the earth. There's a granite melt in the earth, and sometimes it will protrude to the surface in a tube. And so a core then was taken of a granite melt that had solidified 1,683 feet below the surface, and indeed it was taken out, the core sample was there, and granite melted deep in the earth solidifies to rhyolite. Now that rhyolite has the same chemical elements as the original granite, but it does not have the texture, in other words, the large minerals. And it doesn't have the halos. This is what resulted from the actual experiment to try to synthesize granite. That's a fine-grained rock, just like the rhyolite that we just saw. There's no difference. There it is. And so I showed the whole audience that night. I said, this is the answer to what we're talking about tonight. Granite does not reform as a result of the cooling of a melt over a long period of time under pressure and so forth. I said, here is the original granite, and here is what comes out of the experiment. There's no resemblance. And remember this, that in the original granite, the original granite, there are these primordial polonium halos. Guess what happens when granite is melted? And granite is melted and resolidifies like this, or like this piece of rhyolite. There are no halos whatsoever. The work of creation is gone completely. So 22 years down the road now, 22 years down the road, no one has responded. Not only that, but I spoke at the University of Tennessee, again, just a year and a half ago, and I advertised a full-page ad in the Knoxville News Sentinel indicating I was going to be speaking at the University of Tennessee again, and I invited everybody in the city of Knoxville, Tennessee to come, and also I put ads in the Daily Beacon, the student newspaper of the University of Tennessee, to especially inform the students and all the faculty I was going to be there again, so that if they wanted to start the warfare all over again, or the controversy, or if they had the answer, there they were going to have their opportunity. April 9 last year, guess what? I went and I spoke again. How many faculty members were there this time? None. How many students were there as a cheering section? There was one lone student sitting over there in the distance. He didn't say anything. What I'm saying is this is far, far down the road of the God of heaven helping us all to understand. We're dealing with experimental facts that affirm the Genesis record of creation, what God said. So, we'll continue. What I'm saying tonight is also in the book Creation and Tiny Mystery. It's all online if you'd like to read it, halos.com. So we see why the evolutionary theory of an Earth slowly cooled from a hot molten ball over billions of years has never been a valid scientific theory. Best can be compared to the Ptolemaic cosmology debacle. Remember, Ptolemy had the idea that indeed the planets were circling what? The Earth, and the sun was circling the Earth. It was that bad, and it's that bad even today. Nevertheless, the crucial question is, what is the response of the worldwide scientific community been to the primordial polonium halo evidence for creation? And in the decade before the trial in Arkansas, I was a visiting scientist at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and was able to publish a number of scientific papers about this, what we're talking about tonight, in the world's leading scientific journals. David, you want to help us review this?
Yeah, somebody last night was talking to me and saying, exactly what was said in the scientific reports, and I said, well, we'll be bringing out quotations from those, but the stories behind the publication of these reports are actually more interesting, just as interesting as the evidence themselves, because it really focuses your attention on the fact that each published report has a miracle story behind how it got published. In fact, some of the wording from the reports still was able to contain enough information to raise eyebrows. For instance, in Nature, the 1973 report, the phrase that was taken from this report says the half-lives of the polonium isotopes, approximately 3 minutes for polonium-218, are too short to permit anything but a rapid mineral crystallization contrary to accepted theories of magmatic cooling rates. So, in scientific lingo, that's saying, what's accepted is over here, but this is what we have. It's contrary to that. There's some more quotations here, I think.
I want to focus on this just a second. Nature, of course, the editor of Nature magazine at that time and still today, they're evolutionists, strong evolutionists. Not only that, but these papers that I've sent in for publication, they went out to strong evolutionists for review. They had to be peer-reviewed before they were okayed for publication. And this statement that I put in there, as David said, in scientific lingo, that means that indeed we're talking about too short to permit anything but a rapid crystallization. The scientists who read that understood that what we were saying is that the granite rocks had to cool rapidly. Now, they would not, and I may get into have the opportunity here after a while of telling you just a little bit about God's great providence and interacting with some of the editors and the scientists themselves about these results. It's fascinating. As David has said, God's hand was behind the scene all the time that was sending these papers in for publication. But anyway, what
Well,
we're
tell
saying,
them just, since you said that, you can just tell them one brief incident where the reviewer asked you, what are you getting at here? So you just have to briefly say that one little, tell them that one little story.
you dared to open the door for me to talk about this briefly?
I'll tell you what, I'll let you do that if you let me have that clicker.
Well, I believe, we ask for the Lord to lead and guide, and so I think David has asked a question that needs to be answered briefly. And when I was very early starting out, and sending these papers in for publication, I sent one in to the journal Science, their headquarters in Washington, D.C., and the editor, was frowning at me because he saw that indeed what I was sending in for publication was contrary to what he thought was the truth, because he was a professional geologist as well as the associate editor of the magazine. But anyway, he sent my paper out for review, and it came back. The review came back, and normally a review of my scientific papers will never have the reviewer's name on them. But this one did. The reviewer said, I want to talk to you. What in this world are you talking about? So I immediately called him up. And the first thing he said, told him who I was and so forth, he said, yeah, I know who you are. I want to know, what is it you're talking about in this paper? And I said, I'm going to be up front with you. I say, I think these polonium radial halos are evidence of fiat creation. Now, he could have hung up on me, slammed the phone, and said all sorts of negative things. But he said, my grandfather was a Methodist minister. But anyway, after that introduction, he said, what about this? What about this? What about this? More and more technical aspects of the paper. And I answered them. And I said, well, what can we do? I still want to get this paper published. And so he said, well, I tell you what, I want you to do this experiment, this experiment, this experiment, this experiment, and then, send the paper in for publication again, and I'll take another look at it. I did all of that. And then when I finished that, I called him. He was at Carnegie Mellon University. And I said, I finished, I've rewritten the paper and so forth, getting ready to send it in for publication. But before I do that, I want to let you take a look at it. So I flew up to Pittsburgh. He picked me up. This world-renowned evolutionist picked me up, took me to his office there at Carnegie Mellon University. We went over the paper, sentence by paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, word by word, and comma by comma, and period by period, the whole day. At the end of the day, he said, sir, I don't understand. But on the way back, he took me back to the airport that night, catch a plane back to Washington, D.C. He said, and I told him, again, we discussed God actually having these in the rocks to provide evidence of creation. But he said, oh, listen, Bob, I want to tell you, if you say anything about God doing this or God responsible for these halos, I'm going to slam the door. I won't have the paper published, just like that. So anyway, I went back, revised it a little bit again according to his other suggestions, sent it in for publication, and waited and waited and waited and waited and waited, and called, and the editor said, the paper has not come in from this scientist there. And I got very well acquainted with this evolutionist editor there at Science magazine, and he got to know me very well. We went out to eat together with my wife and a friend of ours there. Can you imagine that? Big-time evolutionist, associate editor of the paper, me, a creationist, believing the earth is 6,000 years old, but he sees the weight of the evidence as such. What is he going to do? He sends it out for review, and these people can't turn it over, can't turn it down, they can't overthrow it. And anyway, got to the point it was still waiting for his final review in order to get the paper published. It never came in. And finally, I called one day at the office after I'd been calling for months. I said, what's happened to my paper? And I asked for the editor, and they said, oh, the editor, he's in the hospital. My heart sank. I said, oh, no, this man's been trying to help me to get this paper published for a year, and now he's in the hospital. And I said, do you know where it is? They looked, and they said, we can't find it. I said, it's got to be there somewhere. And they said, well, wait a minute, we'll look one more place. He came back and said, I found it. I said, where is it? It's on the copy editor's desk. The copy editor's desk? Yeah, it's been approved for publication. It's going to be published here in just a few weeks. I can't go on, but anyway, I will go on. I will go on, because after I got the paper back and I had the final review copy and ready the printed copy ready to go in for publication, the editorial copy, I decided to take it back down to the editor and thank him for the fact that indeed he had done so much to help to get the paper published. Went down to see him. sat down and was talking to him there in his office there in Science in downtown Washington, D.C. And he said, Bob, you know, he got out of the hospital. He said, Bob, whatever happened to that paper we had in for publication? I said, John, you don't know. Here's the paper right here. I've got it. It's the copy edited version. It's ready to be published. His face turned pale. He thought, what in the world have I done? Anyway, he said, let me have the paper. I went back home, Pat and I prayed earnestly that God would not let this man back out after all that. And he didn't. The paper was published. It's in the back of my book. Anyway, David, that's what you did in opening that door for me to say something. We could go on and on, but...
Well, I think it's important, you know, part of what we're trying to do is establish credibility for what we're saying. And I don't care who you talk to, where they're from, who they work for, where they went to school, it doesn't make any difference. Do they have published scientific reports refuting this evidence? And I can tell you right now, the answer is no, they don't. So they can complain and they can cry all they want about how they don't believe the polonium halos evidence this or that. But ask them one simple question. What papers have you published to refute that evidence? And the answer is going to be very simple. None. And not only that, the papers that the magazines where these papers were originally published was not the Review and Herald. It wasn't, you know, Ministry Magazine.
Signs of the Times.
Signs of the Times or whatever. It was, you know, the world's premier scientific journals. So to try to take pot shots at the evidence for creation without backing it up with your own published work, to me is not sound. It doesn't make sense. So that's why I think it is important. And yes, when you do look at some of the stories behind how the papers originally got published, to me it only adds more credibility to the story which we're trying to build, and that is basically God really did leave something in the rocks as evidence of His creative power. And you can go to the Bible and you can read the Bible and you can see that what we're saying matches what you read in the Bible. There's no reason why it shouldn't match, because if God left the evidence for creation in the rocks, it's going to match what He has written in the Bible. That's our view of things.
Let's continue. This is what someone else said, again in Science in 1973, that indeed other people were looking at this evidence that I had been publishing, and it says, you know, it was realized very early their existence, meaning the polonium halos, would cause apparently insuperable geological problems since the relevant polonium half-life is of the order of minutes. In other words, they recognize that indeed, if you have them there at all, then it's going to demand something being crystallized, the granite's being crystallized very, very, very rapidly. Then, of course, here's another statement from my other paper there in Nature, David.
In this article in this publication in Nature, the phrase is added, do polonium halos imply that unknown processes were operative during the formative period of the Earth? Is it possible that polonium halos in Precambrian rocks represent extinct natural radioactivity, primordial, and are therefore of cosmological significance?
Now that cosmological significance, see what we were saying is this, whereas people, the geologists, astronomers, everyone in the scientific community believes that the Earth came from the remnants of the Big Bang. And so therefore they're saying that the matter of the Earth actually came from exploding stars billions and billions of years ago. So when I say they're cosmological significance, the polonium halos are cosmological significance, what we're saying is, in their language, that indeed we're saying that the matter that supposedly formed in a supernova got over here to the Earth and was cooled in solid form within just a few minutes. That's what it means. That's the essence of what that statement meant. That was the closest I could come to explain to them that we're talking about instant creation of matter, no matter where supposedly it originated. Not only that, but here we have, and now in science,
that polonium halos could have formed only if the host rocks underwent a rapid crystallization renders exceedingly difficult, in my estimation, the prospect of explaining these halos by physical laws as presently understood. In other words, they don't fit the current evolutionary model.
Not only that, don't fit, but here is something, it's demanding a new paradigm, a new explanation. And guess what's happened? Go ahead and another one.
It is also apparent that polonium halos do pose contradictions to currently held views of Earth history. Massive understatements, as you can see. I mean, these are understatements by a mile. But that's the most powerful, or that's the strongest language that these scientific journals would allow. They're not going to allow him to say, "And I believe God created the Earth, in 6 literal days."
It's interesting to see, at this particular point in time, I had been a guest scientist there at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory filled with people of all persuasions, atheists, agnostics, and whatever. And the management of the laboratory saw me taking these papers going in for publication, and they saw them being accepted, and they saw them being published, and they were wondering, what in the world is going to happen? This man is out there saying these things like this. This was not being done in a vacuum. This is one of the world's elite scientific journals. And they're wondering, they look at me, I was only going to be there supposedly for 1 year as a guest scientist, then the 2nd year, then the 3rd year, then the 4th year, and then the 5th year, and on. And this paper was going in and is saying things like that. That made things shake and rattle there a little bit at the laboratory. But they kept me on. Why? Because there was no one in the scientific community that was refuting any of this. Over and over again, the statements were being made stronger and stronger, and the evidence was growing and growing and growing, and I was still there. So, David, what was the reaction of the scientific community to these reports and conclusions? What was it?
This actually came from a publication that was reviewing the evidence for creation. And they basically made these points. Current physical laws may not have governed the past. Earth's primordial crustal rocks, rather than cooling and solidifying over millions of years, crystallized almost instantaneously. Some geological formations thought to be 100 million years old are in reality only several thousand years old.
Let me give a little background to this. There's a research communications network actually got busy. When they saw my papers coming out as they were, and they saw them being unchallenged, they took it upon themselves, without my knowledge, to send letters to some of the world's prominent scientists, Nobel laureates, in fact, asking them their opinion, their understanding, their comprehension of these papers that are appearing in the scientific journals. They got letters back from a number of these prominent scientists, including Nobel laureates, and they've then published this sort of summary and sent it out everywhere about the radio halos and the implications. And this is what David's going to continue now. We're going to pick out one of the responses from those letters in this organization's magazine report.
Grant these propositions, and any researcher will tell you the entire structure of the historical natural sciences would dissolve into formlessness. Few certainties would remain. Yet these possibilities and others equally disintegrative have been published over the past several years in the world's foremost scientific journals, Nature, Science, Annual Review of Nuclear Science, among others. One of the reviewers that was actually one of the scientists that this Research Communications Network actually asked to comment on the polonium halo research said the following: Gentry's conclusions are startling and shake the foundations of radiochemistry and geochemistry. Yet he has been so meticulous in his experimental work, so restrained in his interpretations, that most people take his work seriously. I think most people believe, as I do, that some unspectacular explanation will eventually be found for the anomalous halos, and that orthodoxy will turn out to be right after all. Meanwhile, Gentry should be encouraged to keep rattling this skeleton in our closet for all it is worth. Professor Edward Anders from the University of Chicago.
One of the world's preeminent geochemists at that particular time. So here tonight we're still trying to rattle that skeleton, and there's more. Remember at the Arkansas creation trial, Dr. Dalrymple, the geologist, called the polonium halos a very tiny mystery. I think it's important to know what the answer to that little mystery is. That's what Dalrymple said. Did he later say anything else about it? Yes, he did. In 1992 and 95, in fundraising letters that were sent out for the Pro-Evolution National Center for Science Education. Let me just give you a background before we get into that. I'm a member of the American Geophysical Union. These letters were sent to me because I'm a member of the AGU. But it was under the letterhead of the National Center, Pro-Evolution National Center for Science Education. Anyway, I saw it. I saw the letter that first came, and I thought, well, this is from the National Center science education, pro-evolution. I'm not interested, so I'm just going to throw it away. Fortunately, David and Pat rescued it, and they read it, and they showed it to me. And are we ever thankful?
Well, you just have to kind of take the, think about the setting here. You get junk mail in the mailbox all the time. And, how often do you really read junk mail? I mean, not too often. I mean, normally you just throw it away. But in this one case, I thought it would just kind of be funny to see what exactly the National Center for Science Education was trying to tell us. I thought this might be interesting, And it just so happens that in the process of reading this random letter that was sent as a fundraising letter, we happened to come along this very interesting phrase embedded in the letter. Basically, well, I'll start out by telling you what it says at the beginning. Dear fellow AGU member, I'm writing to tell you about the National Center for Science Education, an organization of scientists that defends what? Rational science education. That would be opposed to irrational science education, which would be, something that would include creation. Now, the problem, and this is a serious problem, is the fundamentalist opposition to evolution. I know it's hard to believe that evolution can still be a problem in 1992, the time the letter was written, but the opposition to evolution throughout the U.S. and Canada has actually increased during the last year. The movement, this is where it got interesting, the movement called scientific creationism is composed of biblical literalists who claim to have scientific evidence that the world was created all at one time, only a few thousand years ago. Some of our colleagues think that the scientific creationism movement can be ignored, but I think they're wrong. The movement is beginning to affect some college classes too, as members of Genesis clubs enter classrooms with disruptive and difficult to answer questions. How would you answer a student who announced in your class that the second law of thermodynamics doesn't permit evolution, or that the presence of polonium halos in granite demonstrates that granite had to have formed suddenly, i.e. was specially created? I don't know where he got the stories. I would have given really just about anything to have been in some of those classrooms where these random students might have said these things. And the expression on the teacher's face when they said it. Because in all probability, the college professor probably had never heard of, polonium halos. And so when somebody says from the audience, yeah, but what about polonium halos? Doesn't that mean the earth was specially created? He was probably like, what are you talking about? Of course, when you actually look into it, it's actually true. So anybody in the class that actually looked into it, would have come back and said, yeah, that guy knew what he was talking about. There's actually stuff that says that. And so, all this actually got back to guess who? Brent Dalrymple. Brent Dalrymple is the one that wrote this letter. He, above anybody else, knows about the polonium halos. Why? Because he was at the Arkansas creation trial, and he is the one who knew very well the implications of what the polonium halos meant. And furthermore, he said, and I think it's important to know what the answer to that little mystery is. 1981. Fast forward to 1992, still did not have an answer to that little mystery. Don't you think that if he had known or figured out by that time what the answer to that little mystery was, that he would have shared it with all the members of the American Geophysical Union? It makes sense. If there was some naturalistic, he could have said very easily, well, you know what? Here's the answer that you need to give to these students in your classrooms that talk about polonium halos. What you say is you say that the polonium is secondary, derived from uranium, and on and on and on and on. But he doesn't say any of that. He poses the question as a very thought-provoking question, saying, this is a problem. We have people announcing in classrooms saying polonium halos demonstrates granite was formed suddenly. And the second law of thermodynamics doesn't permit evolution. So I think it's interesting to note that the same person that in the trial, the Arkansas trial, said, this is something that can be solved, I want to know what the answer is, really doesn't have the answer years later. And in fact, that was 1992. Fast forward another 15 years.
3 years, 1995.
Well, 1995, but I'm just saying in,
Right.
in 1995 he rewrites the letter. You can see here in 1995 he writes the same letter. It's essentially the same thing, except he says, how would you answer a student who claims that the presence of polonium halos in granite demonstrates that granite had to inform suddenly, i.e. was specially created? In this particular letter, he leaves out the part that talks about the second law of thermodynamics. There's really no answer forthcoming. The answer really is not forthcoming because the true answer is that God left his fingerprints in the rocks to help establish faith in the inspired Word of God, the Bible, for those that are interested.
Let's focus on that as well as you have done there. The fact of the matter is, twice it went out to the 30,000 member American Geophysical Union. And there's a SOS, fellows, help me, help us all. You got students running around here and telling their teachers and everybody else, you got scientific evidence for creation. And that second one, David and I...
In fact, you know, we might even need to form some Genesis clubs around here. So, you know, I think that this might be something that would be useful in just about any college classroom that you can think of.
Yes, I would agree. But anyway, it would cause an uproar. It would cause an uproar if there was a Genesis...
But they're valid questions, so it's not something that, you know, it's a valid question.
All right, let's continue. That was 1995. Brent Dalrymple wrote this huge book, The Age of the Earth, in 1991. Did he mention anything about this tiny mystery and the polonium halos at all? No. Then he wrote another book, 2004, Stanford University Press. Did he write anything about the polonium halos in that book? No. I was in touch with Brent Dalrymple over this period of time because in the year 2000, he edited an issue of the book of the magazine called Geotimes, the monthly magazine of the American Geological Institute, just evolution, 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 evolution. And so I called him. I've been friends with him. I told him, I said, Brent, if the day ever comes when you decide to be a Christian, call me. I want to help you. I'm on good terms with the man. But anyway, at that particular time, because this Geotimes article was coming out, it had come out in 2000, December, I said, and the editor won't let me write anything, I said, Brent, help me. Get in touch with the publisher, Sam Adams. I want to write at least a little letter here in response to what you have said. And this man says, okay, I'll do that. And so in the March issue, 2001 issue of Geotimes, I've got a letter in there. And that letter basically reiterates, let's see if I can get the pointer up here. Can't see it very well. Can't see it at all. Anyway, that letter refers to the letters that we just referred to that Brent Dalrymple on 2 occasions said, you know, what are we going to do about this polonium halo for evidence for fiat creation? Quoting it. And now bringing it out within the magazine itself. Geotimes goes to another 10, 20,000 geologists now. They see that indeed Brent Dalrymple has got an SOS, and this is a mystery that is unsolved, and they see clearly what the implications have to be because Brent Dalrymple himself is saying fiat creation, fiat creation, fiat creation. What are we going to do if we can't solve the problem? So, as we continue then, thousands of geologists saw the letter, no answer was forthcoming. So it's all over with the theory of a naturalistic origin of granite and an anciently evolving earth. That's where we continue. In the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth. The heavens are the work of your hands. Now, he spake and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. So, what scientific impact do polonium and uranium halos and the granites have on the age of the earth? David, that's what we want to take up now. In the age of the earth, the whole idea of the age of the earth being old is simply because geologists will go out and take rocks such as the granites and they'll measure the amount of uranium in the rock and then they'll measure the end product of the uranium decay, which is lead-206. And so they say, well, if we've got slow lead accumulation, that assumes the earth evolved from chaos over billions of years and the uranium decay rate was unaffected by any unusual events in Earth's history. In other words, they assume that indeed if uranium is decaying at the same rate that it is today, they've got a certain amount of lead and a certain amount of uranium, just like water dripping into a bucket, provided you don't turn the spigot up, they can use that as a clock. So this whole idea of the age of the earth is dependent very critically on this whole idea of uranium and the other radioactive elements decaying very, very slowly at their current rate. But the question is the following. First of all, how do the polonium halos provide any evidence at all contrary or agreeing with that? Well, indeed, if you've got primordial polonium halos, as we've already said, then what happens to all these billions of years of granite formation evolving? What happens to it?
Collapses the time frame.
It collapses it to what? Almost nothing. You don't have any time for the ancient rocks to begin to cool and for the radioactivity to begin to decay very, 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 very slowly. As David has said earlier at the top schematic there, that's the usual uniformitarian way of looking at things. You've got radioactive decay, slowly cooling molten granite. But indeed, because you've got the primordial polonium in there, you wouldn't have any halos if it was slow cooling of the granite. Only way it's going to happen is for the granite to have been created instantly along with the radioactivity and the particles to shoot out rapidly to form the halos. So, now it turns out, David, if you want to go ahead and pick up.
You know, we've been talking a lot about polonium halos, but what about the uranium halos? We actually showed a picture of a uranium halo last night. They have a lot more rings than the polonium halos. There's more alpha decay steps from the uranium-238 to the daughter product lead-206. Evolutionists claim that they take hundreds of millions of years to develop these uranium halos. What they don't realize is that they are actually coloration thermometers that tell they could not have developed slowly under the assumption of a constant decay rate and hot conditions deep in the earth. Why is this? It's very simple. Remember, halos cannot form when the rock is molten. They not only cannot form when the rock is molten, they cannot form when the rock is even hot. So the rock has to be in a cooled state. So if you have a fully developed uranium halo, that in itself is an impossible event, assuming a constant rate of radioactive decay of uranium, and several million year half-life, because you cannot propose that that rock has been sitting there with the uranium halo forming for millions of years, because the rock in its lifetime must have been heated to a very high temperature. Anytime that rock was heated to a very high temperature, what happens to the record of the halo? It's gone. So you have to have a uranium halo. You have to hypothesize, how did that uranium halo develop? In this case, it has a long half-life, which you would think, well, that fits the theory of evolution. That doesn't help creation, but it really doesn't make sense in an evolutionary framework either, for a different reason. The different reason being that if it was theorized to form deep underground in the hot environment of the molten magma, then the halo would have never formed just from the sake of temperature alone. Not from the standpoint of half-life, but from the standpoint of just the physical conditions necessary for halo formation.
Let's continue. Let's look at this schematic here one more time. Again, what we're saying is, miles in the earth, we've got this big blob of molten melt, granite melt, and it's going to supposedly, this is now the usual evolutionary way of looking at things, of course. David has already mentioned that. After many thousands of years, it begins to cool from the outer periphery inward, cool, slowly. Then after many millions of years, 50 million years, 100 million years, you finally got, a pool of magma supposedly at the beginning over there on the left, finally cools. That is the way that supposedly El Capitan came into existence according to evolution. In fact, if you go over there, I'm told you'll see signs to that effect. It's hundreds of millions of years old or whatever, deep in the earth for a long, long period of time. And then the reason we see it as it is right now is because it was pushed up in recent geological history. Well, what David has got through telling us here is that here's the uranium halo. That supposedly took, according to evolutionary theory, it's one in my own collection, I see it and so forth, analyze it. It took about several hundred million years, 500 million years to form as a result of the slow uranium decay. But here's the situation, as David had just said, that indeed, I've also analyzed granite cores taken from a deep drill hole in New Mexico, Fenton Hill. And you can see on the left-hand side the feet as the drill core went down. On the right-hand side, the temperature corresponding to the levels, the depth levels, so to speak. And you can easily see, of course, at 3,148 feet, the temperature has already gone up to 105 degrees centigrade. 7,115 feet, it's now at 115 degrees centigrade. 9,508 feet, 197 degrees centigrade. 12,885, 277 degrees centigrade. 14,131, 313 degrees centigrade. 3 times the boiling point of water. The interesting thing is, when I was examining these core samples, I extracted the zircons from them and looked at the thin sections of the granites under the microscope. Guess what I saw about the way in which the coloration of the halos looked? At the surface, they looked just like you saw in that last picture, the uranium halo. Very, very well developed. The coloration was full. But guess what was happening as we went down? Well, it didn't take long. At 3,148 feet, 105 degrees centigrade, the halos had begun to fade considerably. And by the time we get down to 7,115 feet, 115 degrees centigrade, virtually all gone. The annealing had taken place so rapidly at that point. There were no halos. So below that, 197 degrees, 277, 313 degrees, no halos. Now keep that in mind. Just down 7,000 feet or thereabouts in this particular point, the temperature 151 degrees, the halos were almost all annealed. What is going to happen then below that? Nothing. Could halos form even below that temperature? The answer is no, as you were saying. So what do we have? Go ahead, David. You've already said it. Maybe you just want to summarize it again.
Yeah, we've already said pretty much what's in this slide here.
They could only have formed in rocks that existed about the present temperature. In other words, instead, the uranium halos could never have developed if all the granites had cooled slowly from a hot melt over eons of geologic time, because the higher temperatures existing deep in the crust would have erased them. Remember, the geological theory says 1,000 degrees, 900 degrees, 800 degrees, that's when supposedly the granites begin to form. 500 degrees. There's no way any coloration at all will develop, and yet that's exactly the way, supposedly, the geologists think that the uranium halos form. Deep in the earth, hot. No way. It would not have had any halos whatsoever. What we have here is a situation where the only way you can have those uranium halos in the here and now is that they developed at essentially the temperatures they are right now, and that the decay process took place more rapidly from some event, some unusual event in Earth's history. Now, we're going to continue here and say there's confirmation of what we're saying, very specific confirmation, again from material taken from the Fenton Hill drill site. Now we're going to look at this again. Here we have the different temperatures, as we have seen before. I took granite cores from each one of those slices, so to speak, and this time took the granite cores and separated out what we call the zircons. Zirconium silicates, and have a little bit of uranium, and so therefore, these are the zircons, microscopic zircons, taken under polarized light, and these form the basis then of the experiments we're going to tell you about right now. David, tell us a little about this. Is now a single zircon crystal, and our friend Russ Humphreys has got this diagram for us. Tell us what it's basically saying here.
Well, you have the whole nuclear decay process happening within the zircon, and with each successive nuclear decay, you have the alpha particles or the helium nuclei being emitted from the radio centers of the halos. So you have an accumulation of helium within the zircons. So what you can actually do is measure the retention of helium in each zircon and then determine what you would expect the helium retention to be on the basis of evolution, and compare that to what the data actually is when you go to each various level, and you can make a determination as to whether or not the data fits in anciently evolving Earth.
The next chart shows the temperature rises to over 3 times the bottom to the boiling point of water. We've already seen that at the bottom of the hole. What was of most interest as far as the age of the granite was concerned is the very high retention of helium in tiny radioactive zircons, even at the very high temperatures. Let's see if we can get an idea of basically the principle, the theory behind what we're going to be looking at. Suppose we had a picture of the Fenton Hill site here just a minute ago. Let me run back to that real quick like there. David, we're just going to make an imaginary experiment here. It's important for everyone to understand we're at the top of the drill here, and I've got a bucket of water full, and I let it down at the bottom of the drill hole, but I don't tell you how long I keep it down there. You come in after the day is finished and so forth. Initially it was full of water, and when you see it, when it comes back up, I tell you it's 90% full. Now, would you say it's been there for 10 hours, 5 hours, 1 hour, or only about 10 minutes? What would you say? How long has it been down there? Let me do it again. Let me do it again.
No, let me try to say this another way. If you have the zircons containing this helium, and your model of the Earth is that the Earth is old, and you dig up these helium these zircons containing helium, and they still retain too much helium, too much for evolution to explain, what do you have? You have evidence for a young Earth. The reason why is because, just like he was saying, it's the same principle that if you were to lower a bucket of water in a deep hole, you'd have so much steam and so much heat that it would boil that water away very quickly. So if you were to lower a bucket of water down deep in the earth and pull it out and no water is left, well, obviously you've left it down there quite a while. But if you lower it down and you pull it out right away and there's still water there, then you know the water hasn't been down in that hole very long. That's the same exact thing that's happening with the helium zircons. The core samples were collected, the zircons were separated out, the helium was measured, and it turns out that the amount of helium that was measured in the zircons was too great to be explained on the basis of an ancient Earth. And so basically we have two lines of evidence. We have the line of evidence from the polonium halos, which shows that granite cooled rapidly, was formed rapidly. Then we have the evidence of a young age of the Earth from the retention of helium in the zircons. You wouldn't expect much retention of helium in the zircons because evolution says the Earth is old. And so in fact, most of these deeper depths, you shouldn't have any helium in the nuclei of these zircons or within these zircons. But in fact, you still see...
This particular chart right here simply says, you can see the dots above, the half circles there represents the helium in the zircons to begin with, and you can see the dots over there to the right.
More dots means that it's boiling away faster.
Now,
so the deeper you go, the faster the helium's boiling out of these zircons.
Now this chart actually shows what was found, that indeed the actual circles are all gone there and very, very deep, and then at 197 degrees centigrade, only a tiny bit left, and then of course closer to the surface you've got still quite a bit there. So differential retention of the helium was the result of, indeed, the zircons being at high temperatures, and it got to the point where the temperatures were enough so that, indeed, it's all gone later on. Now, that is basically the analysis. That's what the experiment showed. Now, on the left-hand side over here, what do you expect to find on the basis of a long age of the Earth, billions of years? Only a tiny bit of helium, even there at the very surface, at 3,148 feet. What we found is some helium all the way down almost to 277 degrees centigrade. So what that means is it could have only been down there. Those zircons at that temperature could only have been down there a relatively short period of time, and that was published. I published that in Geophysical Research Letters way back in 1982, right before I was asked to leave the Oak Ridge National Laboratory because I testified for creation at the Arkansas trial. Well, I didn't have time to do all that I wanted to do there, but I did get this paper published. Fortunately, the Institute of Creation Research decided a number of years ago, they called me and said, Bob, we think this is important. We want to try to duplicate the experiments. Tell us exactly what you did, and I did. They had a member of their staff that was associate professor of their staff, ICR, who was also a member of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, so he was able to get the same type of core samples that I'd gotten. They sent those core samples off and extracted the zircons. I told them what to do, a separate laboratory. Then they took those zircons and they had them mass analyzed, just as I had done at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory way back in the late 70s, early 80s. And guess what? Their final calculation of the age of the Earth based on their new results agrees with the estimate in my paper. They arrive at a definite average value of about 5,680 years plus or minus 2,000 years, obviously very much in agreement with results obtained from biblical genealogical records from Adam to Christ. Here is the schematic now that shows basically, we don't have time to go into all the details. If you go to the ICR website and look at ICR and the helium retention, you'll be able to find all of this. So we'll go to the next one, and again, you can see the estimated age, the bottom figure down there, 5,680 years plus or minus 2,000 years. That's the diffusion age based on the experimental work. And let me tell you, the geologists have not touched this work. They haven't touched the primordial polonium halos. They haven't touched this work of finding the high retention of helium in these granitic cores. So, here's another schematic it was made there by ICR. Basically, nuclear decay supposedly would be a billion and a half years for the zircons and radioactive decay there. But the very fact of the matter is, what we actually find in the rocks contradicts that on the right and suggests that indeed there was a rapid increase of radioactive decay producing a lot of helium in a short period of time, and that's the reason why we got the results that we did. So what this means is, remember earlier we said that indeed the radioactive dating methods depend upon what? The slow accumulation of uranium to its lead product. The other option is the rapid accumulation of lead resulting from different physical laws put in effect at the fall of Adam and Eve and the worldwide flood. Huge changes occurred, even at creation when sin entered the picture. Huge changes occurred, of course, at the fall of Adam and Eve. And indeed, remember, everyone was built to live forever, and right after the fall, everyone begins to die. The physical laws that govern this world were different after the entrance of sin than they were before. Something was happening, and let's put it this way. Today there's a lot of heat in the earth, molten core, whatever. Radioactivity produces heat. When it's out in the open, the heat dissipates. When it's in the earth, and it's made very, very quickly, guess what happens? Rocks melt. And so deep in the earth today, there is heat, a lot of it.
Were there dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden?
Pardon?
I said, were there dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden?
We're going to get to that. Not dinosaurs, but the precursors of dinosaurs.
Okay.
What are we talking about tonight? A lot of that's in this video, which will be available tomorrow night, or it's on the website. You can go and just look at it there, www.halos.com. The Grand Canyon, and then we don't have a lot of time. We want to get to the dinosaurs, David. What do you say about the Grand Canyon?
Well, anybody that's been to the Grand Canyon is struck by the flat pancake layering of each individual layer. You see the coconino sandstone there kind of stands out. But in an evolutionary model, you would expect there to be a lot of erosion and infilling during the millions of years that it took for each successive layer to be deposited on top of the other. But instead, you see very crisp lines of sediment, one right after the other, very uniform. And the reason why is very simple, because those layers of rock were laid down very rapidly at the time of the worldwide flood. And then they were cut through just as rapidly with some of the giant tidal waves that occurred after the flood. So there's absolutely no question that the Grand Canyon is one of the greatest evidences that we have of a worldwide flood. There's no way that you can explain the flat, very precise layering that you see there in the Grand Canyon on the basis of an evolutionary model of the Earth. It can't happen. So the sedimentary rocks there are young rocks. They're actually date from the time of the flood. And you have, of course, at the very base of the Grand Canyon, the non-fossiliferous rocks, the igneous rocks, which, of course, we're saying form the foundations of the continents.
All right, David, very quickly, tell us, you know all about this particular... The audience needs to understand very quickly what they're looking at here.
Well, very quickly, this is a slide that shows present-day oil formation in the Gulf of California, the Guaymas Basin. It illustrates the fact that some of the oil deposits that we see today in the earth, in the Middle East and elsewhere, those oil deposits actually could have formed very rapidly. the conditions that are required to make not only oil, but coal and all these things which geologists have thought take literally hundreds of thousands of years to form, can actually form rapidly. And if you look at the video, Young Age of the Earth, you can see us actually detail out exactly how that occurs. But it's true that coalification, the coalification process of just plain wood can actually happen just in a few weeks. And we show how that happens in the video. The present day oil formation here shows that oil can actually form under the right conditions rapidly. It makes sense then that if you have the worldwide flood occurring with all the heat generated, with the volcanic activity generated, you have perfect conditions for a rapid formation of the vast oil reserves, which we see, or which we don't really see, but we know that they exist because the oil companies mine them and, of course, use them to produce the petroleum products which we use so often today.
So we want to understand that indeed oil and coal are actually originate with under heat and pressure and so forth of the organic material, trees, plants, and everything that were, fish and everything that were buried in the earth at the time of the flood. Then we go to the time over there in Utah when you and I were discussing. You were telling us about the rapid formation of the coalified wood there and some of the places in Utah and the experiment that we did in the laboratory showing that indeed you can take a piece of wood, as David was saying, and under the right conditions you can take it a long way toward the road of being coal in just a few weeks. As again in the video, Young Age of the Earth. Here I am down in the coal mine there in Price, Utah. David had gone there earlier and scouted out everything and got it ready for me to go down. And there is a dinosaur track in the roof of the coal mine. David, tell us.
Yeah, I recommend anybody that wants to see evidence of dinosaurs, go to Dinosaur National Monument. Go to the go to Price, Utah. Ask to see the coal mines which actually contain these dinosaur tracks in the roofs of these coal mines. I mean, they're all over the place. I walked in there myself. I saw these. They're all over the place. Dinosaurs did exist. I believe they existed prior to the flood. I don't necessarily think that they were preserved in the ark at the time of the flood. Now, there's varying opinions on that. I realize that. And I respect the people that believe that dinosaurs still roam around on the earth today somewhere, but we don't believe that ourselves. We believe that dinosaurs perished at the time of the flood. If you go to Dinosaur National Monument in Vernal, Utah, you can actually see these dinosaurs had a very catastrophic ending to their lives. Some of them were ripped apart by what I feel like were violent, ferocious actions of the floodwaters that were actually operative at the time of their death. It's very impressive to see that. And they weren't walking around when they were making these tracks. They were running around looking for higher ground. As each wave of sediment came in, washed over them, they were tromping along on this, making new tracks. The new sediment would come in, perfectly preserving these dinosaur tracks until thousands of years later when they're uncovered by the mining companies there in Price, Utah. So there's no question about the fact that dinosaurs existed. The only question is there's differing opinions on how long ago they existed. And I would like to say that dinosaurs existed very recently. Recently, in fact, if you look at the video, Young Age of the Earth, you can actually see we photograph a dinosaur track in relation to a coalified log. That coalified log is something which is relatively recent. It dates the lives of the dinosaurs with the time of the flood. And I think that there's good evidence to show that the dinosaurs did exist with the antediluvians. What are antediluvians?
Several thousand years ago. They were antediluvians. But you asked the question earlier, of course, what about where did the dinosaurs come from? We want to put our viewpoint in here, and that is that the original kinds which God created in the creation week, he said all things were good, and perfect. The dinosaurs, in my opinion, David's opinion, were not good and perfect. They were terrible creatures, very rapacious. They're out there tearing people. People lived at the same time, and other dinosaurs and other things apart. We believe there was genetic manipulation occurring in pre-flood days that rapidly took the original Genesis kinds and produced these dinosaurs. That's what we're believing. In fact, the Bible tells us there was a giant intellect that came, was thrown to this earth, and he basically had in his mind something to destroy God's creation and to pervert the original creation. And so we believe that genetic engineering occurred relatively soon after the fall of man. And so over the 1,000 years or so before the flood, the dinosaurs were beginning to proliferate. But indeed, we believe that indeed God, foreseeing that they were going to tear the world apart if they got into the ark and came here today, or later of course, he did not allow them. Remember, the Bible says that the uncleans were not taken into the ark except by pairs, and the cleans were taken in by sevens. So there was a discrimination. We believe that the dinosaur original, whatever it was not taken into the ark, and that process has not, God has not allowed that process to at least continue at the present time. There are some things, and so David, we have then the dinosaurs supposedly in all these different geological epochs, so to speak, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Eocene. In papers we don't have time to discuss with you tonight. We've had codified wood specimens from all these areas, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Eocene, and just like with the primordial polonium halos, we found other evidence to show that indeed all these presumed geological eras, so different by 80 million, 110 million, and so forth, 200 million, they're all the same. They're all just buried there together in deposits at the time of the worldwide flood several thousand years ago. The ancient Earth evolutionary time scale, the granites that supposedly are going to go from 150 million years to 300 million years to 4 billion years and so forth, it all has collapsed because the isotope ratios, you see, are different. There was something going on non-uniform even throughout the Earth itself that caused different isotope ratios, and the evolutionists have interpreted those ratios to give you, quote, different ages for the foundation rocks. And then the collapse of evolutionary time, the simultaneous creation of Earth's foundation rocks just several thousand years ago. You go from the granite there in Yosemite's and the Sierras to the basement rocks of the Grand Canyon and to Japan and Europe, Russia, and around the world in Canada. They're all the same. It's all part of the same creation. And we're saying basically the Lord left his fingerprints in the rocks, the foundation rocks that he created, to show us all tonight, to affirm to us that indeed by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was done, and he commanded, and it was, and it did stand fast. So with that, David, you want to end for us?
Exodus 20, verse 11. Fourth commandment, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
That's our conclusion. We believe it's biblical and it's scientific. And we thank you so much for the opportunity of being with you this evening. Dave and I are very, very thankful to be with you tonight. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks, and then the program will continue together. I want to help you to understand that I'm a scientist who has been doing research in the area of creation science for a long time. We've made some progress, which we're going to help you to understand tonight, hopefully. Tonight, David and I are going to bring you the results of not just a few days or a few weeks or a few years, but in my case, a few decades of research. We're going to incorporate what we say scientifically with what the Bible says. And before it's all over tonight, maybe some of you will have a new insight as to where we all came from and what the Bible says as being authentic in every respect. David?
From Genesis 1:1, we want to try to link the phrase in the beginning to something we can know and understand from the New Testament. And it turns out that Jesus' own words in the New Testament help us to put a time frame on the phrase in the beginning. But from the beginning, God made them male and female. So if we can link the term in the beginning to the creation of male and female, we've solved one of the big questions in biblical exegesis, and that is exactly when was the earth created? If you believe that the earth was created during creation week, then your answer is solved. And Jesus tends to use that, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. When were Adam and Eve created? In the beginning.
And it's within the 6 days of creation, it says, everything, all that was in them is, heaven, earth, sea, and all that in them is. And so therefore, David, if that is the case, all that in them is, what does that mean about El Capitan?
We're trying to get across an idea. The idea is that can you identify some of the original created material that God spoke into existence during creation week? Now certainly you can look outside here and you can look at some of the man-made objects, and we know for a fact that none of that was part of the original creation. You can even go to places like the Grand Canyon, and you know that that probably was not the way it looked at the time of creation. Even El Capitan itself is probably not the way it looked at creation, but the thing that makes El Capitan different than the Grand Canyon is what? El Capitan is an igneous rock, a rock that was formed, as geologists call it, from a melt. A pluton, a gigantic pluton. We're going to look more into details about exactly what we mean by that. Whereas the Grand Canyon is sedimentary rock, rock that was formed by layers of sediment piling up on one another, then being cut through by massive action of water, which we believe happened during the flood. Psalm 33, 6 and 9 speaks to the rapidity with which God spoke the world into existence. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. The language of that verse tends to make you think that when God speaks, matter comes into existence. It's not something that takes a long time. The spoken word becomes matter. It's instantaneous. The thought that Jesus can create matter, or that God can create matter, should not come as a surprise to anyone who believes in the Bible, believes in the miracles of the Bible, but it is an alien thought for those who have not really given it too much thought in the past. But we're going to be actually looking at evidences in the rocks that suggest that they do not fit a uniformitarian model as the evolutionists must have in order for their theory to be correct. Fortunately, our theory, we don't need to abide by uniformitarianism. We have, by nature of the creation model, has in its, at its core, the existence of singularities, or in biblical terms, miracles. Look at Romans 4:17. God who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Again, God speaks and he calls into existence things that do not exist.
David, would it be fair to say that what we believe then with respect to Romans 4:17 and that granite rock El Capitan, that God spoke and it came into existence?
Not only that, that's just a minuscule amount of what was spoken into existence on day one of creation week.
Just a minuscule amount. That's true. That's true. But the fact of the matter is, people here in California, if they understand what we're saying tonight, they can go and take a piece or at least look at El Capitan and many of the other granite rocks, and they can pick it up and say, oh, this is something that God called into existence. This is what we're getting at tonight. And then not only in Genesis and in the fourth commandment, but what do we have here in the book of Revelation?
Well, for those of us who are Seventh-day Adventists, this verse is very familiar. Not only do we look at Genesis as a guide to tell us about creation, in Exodus, in the fourth commandment, we can go all the way to Revelation. Revelation 14, and I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel, to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. It's interesting to note that God chooses to identify himself in the book of Revelation in a very specific way. He wants to identify himself as the God who made heaven and earth and the sea. All of these things God made, and he wants to identify himself as the creator.
So if the earth was created by God, there must exist in the beginning rocks. That is, Genesis rocks, the Genesis rocks that God called into existence on day one of creation week. And now it says, in the beginning and the foundations of the earth. What does it say about this, in the beginning?
Sometimes it's nice to go to the Bible and actually try to get some phraseology that helps us put in perspective exactly what we see when we go to the science. And in this case, Hebrews 1:10 uses the phrase, foundations of the earth. Now, we're going to actually key in on that a little bit, and we're going to look at something just a little bit later that actually tries to identify what are the foundations of the earth. Because in the Bible it says, in the beginning, when was in the beginning? From the beginning he made them male and female. We'd like to submit to you that in the beginning actually means creation week. It's not something that's, shrouded in mystery here. It's pretty straightforward. In the beginning, you laid the foundations of the earth. When you build a building, what do you start with? You start with the foundation. You start with basically digging a hole and then laying the foundation. Before the foundation is laid, there's nothing.
What we're saying is God himself actually identified for the here and now which rocks were the in the beginning rocks, which rocks were actually created. They're specified as those which are the foundations of the earth. And we're going to return to this again. David, there was a drill hole back in the Kola Peninsula. What's that all about?
Science News is just a popular news magazine that kind of tries to capture the headlines in science. And in this particular article, the article talked about Earth's foundation rocks revealed by a deep drill hole in the Kola Peninsula in
David,
Russia.
How far down did it go?
And it went down almost 40,000 feet into the earth, which of course is just a little bit compared to the overall radius of the earth, or the diameter of the earth. But nevertheless, it was deeper than what had originally ever been drilled before. And in the process of drilling this hole, scientists were actually testing what the results of drilling this hole were, the actual core samples that they were collecting, versus what the theory, scientific theory, was predicting would be at those depths. And it's interesting to note that the article just says, we can just read it, geologists are often interested in studying the hard crystalline rocks that form the foundation of all continents. According to theory, the crust resembles a layer cake with sedimentary rock layers on top, acidic granite-type rocks on the bottom. Now that's the theory. When the drill actually reached a depth of 7.5 kilometers, or over almost 40,000 feet, the scientists did not find basaltic rock. The Soviets now believe that if the basaltic layers exist, they must lie much deeper. Kola revealed how far from truth scientific theory can roam.
What they're basically saying is they thought they were going to hit granite rocks right away and then go down into basaltic rocks, which is a secondary rock. But it turns out it was granite down 40,000 feet. That's why they said the granitic foundation rocks. So we're saying that indeed by geological drilling into the earth, geology has actually affirmed experimentally that indeed the granite rocks are the skeletal framework, so to speak, just like our bones are, of course, for our bodies. The granite rocks are the skeletal rocks, so to speak, of all the continents, truly the foundation rocks. If the earth was formed, remember we said by creation, then we had in the beginning and what we just read about the foundations of the earth. But now we're saying if the earth, however, was formed by evolutionary processes, then
there must exist rocks that formed naturally by cooling slowly over the presumed long ages of geological time. What and where are they?
So we're aiming toward this contrast between something that was created and something that evolved slowly. And what are the geologists saying about that? Interesting, there are some similarities. Geologists claim to know which rocks form naturally by slow cooling, and what they claim is the multi-billion year age of the Earth. They postulate, again now, hard crystalline rocks such as granites are those rocks. It is the linchpin of all the theory of evolution. Now we really need to understand what we're getting at here. See, the evolutionists are saying that they too have a special interest in granites. They too have a special interest in El Capitan. But it's far different than what we have been saying.
Their theory can be summarized by this slide. Molten rock or molten magma is theorized to exist miles and miles below the Earth's surface. Over the course of hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of years, this molten magma cools from the outside in slowly. And in the process of cooling, it's also under great pressure. So the resultant type of rock is what geologists call an igneous rock, but in particular, these types of rocks that form so deep underground are typically, a popular example is a granite rock, such as the El Capitan. So you could say if that's really true of how granite forms, how come you see El Capitan rising above the ground as it is? Well, geologists would be quick to tell you that that's not where El Capitan formed, but it formed deep underground, cooling slowly over millions of years.
David, let me ask you a question. It says evolutionary theory of granite formation. We're going to come back to this from time to time, but that word theory, for example, we see volcanoes erupt and the lava comes out and the rocks form. There's no theory there. There's an actual experimental observation. Why does it say evolutionary theory? We need to clarify that.
It's a theory because it's difficult to take the processes that are theorized to occur deep in the Earth and to put that into a laboratory. It doesn't mean that it hasn't been tried. In fact, we're going to look a little bit later at where scientists have actually tried to duplicate the conditions deep in the Earth with slow cooling to try to duplicate what they feel like happened with the formation of granite rock. For instance, if you have a sedimentary rock, such as a sandstone, you can actually take the constituents of sandstone and put them together, put them in a press, and actually sort of form sandstone itself in a laboratory under conditions similar to what it's theorized to form naturally. But granite rock is a little bit different. When you go to attempt to make a granite rock using the formative processes which are theorized to cause granite rock, you actually find that you get a different type of rock, a rhyolite. And this is going to be kind of a very important part of our presentation, that man cannot reproduce what God has created. And before you just completely turn that off, let's look at some of the yet more evidences that we have that perhaps these rocks really are created rocks and not something that forms slowly over geologic time. There's a booklet, Science and Creationism. And this booklet was published by the National Academy of Sciences. Who has heard of the National Academy of Sciences? Anyone? It's a very prestigious scientific organization. And basically what they say goes. If you disagree with them, you're wrong. And this is what they have to say. In their booklet, published in 1984, they said, listen, folks, in layman's terms, we've given special creation a chance. We've done everything we can to sympathetically consider it. And you know what? It's wrong. In the forms given in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, the theory of special creation is now an invalidated hypothesis. Now just hold on a minute there. Look at what the atheists are saying about what is spoken of in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. In their model, the first 2 chapters of Genesis describes a special creation, not some long geologic evolutionary process. So if you believe in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, you've got to believe in a special creation. That's even the National Academy of Sciences even would agree with that. But the point here, of course, is that they say that special creation is an invalidated hypothesis. In other words, scientifically, it's not true. But we would like to present evidence tonight that would show that it is true.
You know, David, as you say, they've had fantastic influence here in America over the last several decades because the National Academy of Sciences is composed of the leading scientists here in America and even around the world. So when they speak, then of course, you know, vast numbers of people, laymen and so forth, take it as gospel truth. And they're basically putting out the word, as you have just said, that the Bible is wrong. Now, they're not saying that God doesn't exist, but that's what's implying. They're basically saying God is a liar when they say that Genesis has been invalidated by professional people, by people who really know what's going on. In other words, the rest of us people, you know, supposedly don't know as much as they do. We just don't know. But if you really knew all the truth that they know, all the science they know, supposedly you would believe like that. Well, David and I have some other things to say about that. We say, however, that God does not intend, this is David and I talking tonight, God does not intend that the Bible record of the literal Genesis 6-day creation and the seventh-day Sabbath rest to lapse into obscurity and ridicule without providing scientific evidence that affirms these records. In other words, we're taking big-time exception with what the National Academy of Sciences says. We're doing it not only from the Bible, we're going to do it from the standpoint of science and show it's exactly the opposite of what they've been saying for all these years. We also say the Lord has allowed us, David and I, to discover the evidence, this evidence that overturns what the National Academy of Sciences is saying. We're saying that God has allowed us to discover evidence that affirms literally what the Bible says in Genesis, Fourth Commandment, and all parts of the Bible that relate to creation. The Lord has allowed us to discover this evidence of all places, and it's embedded in the granites, God's Genesis rocks. Well, there it is. The evidence is embedded there, and we're going to find out what this evidence is here as we continue. Years ago, as I spoke at the University of Tennessee, I wrote a letter to the then president of the National Academy of Sciences. And basically what I was saying to him is, I'm offering therefore you, whoever you may choose to send in your stead, an opportunity for refuting the evidence for creation published in my scientific reports and summarized in my book. I'll refer specifically to when that was said sometime later. But he is president. At that time, he was president of the National Academy of Sciences. And before I spoke at the University of Tennessee, I wrote him a letter. And I said, you know, I don't believe what you're saying is true in the National Academy of Sciences booklet we just spoke about. You said Genesis has been invalidated. But I'm going to present evidence that night at the University of Tennessee to overturn what you say and to show that indeed there is scientific evidence for creation. And I said, I'm inviting you to come. If you think you have anyone in the staff of the National Academy of Sciences to come and overturn or refute this evidence I'm going to present, which has been widely published, you should come, or you should send some people. Well, he didn't come, but he wrote this letter. He wrote a letter to me afterward. And that's interesting in itself. Press's answer, his answer that night, your work on radio halos is a matter of record in journals and can be debated by scientists. That's the way science works. I cannot agree with your contention that one small piece of data invalidates the vast body of evidence from geology, astronomy, biology, radio dating, the fossil record, genetics, and other fields that, taken together, irrefutably show the age of the Earth is about 4.5 billion years. Let's get the background here. See, Frank Press, eminent scientist, president of the National Academy of Sciences. I had been publishing for years evidence for creation, and everybody had been ignoring it. I was then going to speak at the University of Tennessee, and I wrote him this very, very straightforward letter, and I said, you think you got it all made? And I said, we're going to overturn everything you're saying, and we're going to do it tonight at the University of Tennessee. And see what he says? He says, we cannot believe, cannot agree that your condition, one small piece of data invalidates everything, geology, astronomy, biology, radio dating. That's exactly what David and I plan to do, intend to do tonight. Well, as we continue, there's something special we're talking about is, guess where? It's in granite rock, which is what it's made of. El Capitan is made of granite. This is a piece of granite rock. Something special is found in the black mica specks in granite rock, not only in El Capitan, but in granite rocks all over the world. When Frank Press talked about the small piece of data, he didn't bring out the fact that indeed it's all over the world. He sort of hid that in that letter. But anyway, David, there's that granite rock, and it's got some pieces of little black mineral, mica, in it. And we're going to look now under the microscope and we're going to see rings. A center, you can see a dark center there. If you look carefully, I'll try to isolate it there on the screen. And there indeed we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rings. Where in the world did they all come from? This was taken through a microscope, so of course it's very, very small. And so, David, this is a cross-section now. Tell us what we're looking at.
Well, you have to understand that the granite rock that you saw in just a few slides ago, what you actually do is you find crystals of the larger crystals of the black specks in the granite actually exist in certain locations, making it very easy to make thin sections from those crystals, and then those you can analyze under the microscope through a light transmission microscope. And in the process of doing that, you do see these, after a bit of looking, some concentric circles, which actually are three-dimensional objects, spheres, concentric spheres, which when you slice them through cross-section appear as rings when you look at them in the 2 dimensions. And what it means is that there's a tiny radio center that was radioactive and emits through nuclear decay alpha particles, and with each successive alpha decay through various steps toward stability, you have one more ring being formed as the literally millions of alpha particles are being showered out in 3 dimensions from this radio center. And as the alpha particles go out, they actually discolor the biotite or the mica matrix so that a record is left in the granite. Now, there are certain rules that you have to be aware of in order to have halo formation occur. One of those is that the rock needs to be in a cooled state. In other words, it can't be hot, certainly can't be molten, can't be cooling slowly over millions of years in a hot molten state. If you had it that way, the halos would never form. So you need the rock to be in a very cooled state and, in a sense, able to capture the radioactive decay. So this is a schematic showing which alpha energies correspond to each ring that we saw in the picture there.
It's not important that you actually understand all the actual ins and outs of those ring structures there, but what we want to do now is to go to the next one and say that indeed this is the alpha decay chain of uranium, and it's all those particles being emitted and all the daughter products there. And we don't need to go into all the details, we just want to show you that's the alpha decay chain of uranium. But then, I want to go back there just a minute. You notice that indeed at the last part of that decay chain is polonium, 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 polonium. Now, that polonium in the uranium decay chain would be called secondary because it's a derivative, a daughter of the original uranium nucleus. But now also, what would happen, for example, if instead of starting at the uranium, we start now with polonium, and polonium-218 to 214 to 210, and then lead. This is important because we're going to find that indeed this idea of primordial polonium.
This is from the isotope polonium-210.
That's the isotope.
As you can imagine, the polonium-210 isotope just has one alpha particle, hence you just have one ring. Now, the proponents of the people that don't believe, well, actually, we should talk more. Let's just keep talking here about what the polonium halos mean in terms of creation.
Our monitor has come back, David.
The whole idea, that's okay. The whole idea is that if you have an isotope which has a very short half-life, and you have that very short half-life isotope in a rock, which has already been theorized and proven irrefutably to have taken billions of years to form, and yet that isotope only lasts for just the length of time of the half-life of that isotope. In the case of polonium-210, it's 138 days. In the case of polonium-218, it's 3 minutes. Then you have to explain somehow in your model, not our model, not the creation model, in your model. Let's say your model is evolution. You have to somehow explain in your model how did the polonium halos survive for hundreds of millions of years while your molten rock was cooling, and the polonium halos, the polonium that was in that rock was decayed, hundreds of millions of years ago, before your rock even cooled. And so people have thought about that a little bit, and they say, well, it must mean then that there must be some other source of polonium that's feeding the radiohalo inclusion sites of these polonium halos. In fact, many people believe that, because there's essentially, if you don't believe that, there's no other way to explain polonium halos except in any other model except basically instant creation. And so people are diving on that explanation, because that's all they have for their very existence. They're diving on that, because if they can't somehow say that the polonium that formed that polonium halo was somehow derived from uranium, and by the way, uranium has a long half-life of the order of millions of years, then you're locked into a paradox. The paradox of how you have a short-lived isotope in your long-lived rock. And so there you have it. But if you believe in the creation model, it's not a problem at all. You just say, oh, it's easy. God, when he created the rock, he created the polonium isotopes in the rock, and then they started to decay after creation. And he did that to leave a record of his creation. That would be our model. And so you can actually do some scientific experiments to try to verify, whether or not the polonium that caused these halos is actually primordial polonium or secondary polonium. Secondary polonium would be from uranium-238. Primordial polonium would be polonium which has no precursor, polonium that was made from the beginning. Polonium basically that you have to admit was created by God in the beginning.
Let's go ahead and show them some more of these polonium halos as you were talking about. Can you believe this? The Lord actually put a pair of spectacles, so to speak, in a rock, in a granite rock. What's happened is that one of those halos we just saw, many of them were actually emplaced one right after another or decayed there. So now we're looking at the spectacle halo, which no one has ever had a satisfactory explanation for, except that God created it. Here we have these two halos with the two rings, the inner ring, the outer ring, and this one now actually began. We don't have to all know the details tonight, but it's from the isotope of polonium. Polonium just being...
Go back to that slide just for a second. You see the line going down there between to the radio center on the right there, on that right polonium-214 halo there? That is what the detractors will say. Aha, you see that little line? That's what the uranium must be flowing through to feed that polonium radio center. But, the problem is that if there's uranium in that solution that's supposedly feeding that polonium inclusion site, it absolutely has to leave alpha decay tracks in its wake as it's traveling to the site. There's no way that, in other words, uranium is an alpha emitter. As it's flowing to that site, it has to leave some kind of record that it's there. So basically, the point of all the scientific papers which were published at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory was to try to document the lack of evidence of uranium feeding these halo inclusion sites. So whoever you talk to that says, oh, no, the polonium halos are secondarily created, or they're secondarily made by being fed by uranium solutions going through the mica, doesn't really understand what the published papers were trying to explain. This is a very critical point. I mean, we could sit here and talk the rest of the night just about this one point. The point is that you cannot have a uranium solution feeding these sites without evidence that the uranium was there. You can't turn off the alpha decay of that uranium while it's feeding your polonium halo inclusion site. You can't do it. So there's ways to actually etch the mica with acid to actually see the alpha recoil tracks. You can actually measure the density of those alpha recoil tracks and say, you know what? If uranium is feeding these sites, then we should be able to see an increased density of alpha recoil tracks heading or feeding these polonium halo inclusions. What in fact you see is a diffuse background, a background of alpha recoil tracks which has no increased density as they go to the radio halo centers. None. Right there in and of itself is proof that nothing else is going on. But you could, and there's lots of other questions that people have asked. They said, well, if God really wanted to prove that the Earth was created using radio halos, why didn't he make halos from the other decay chains, the thorium decay chain, or other short-lived halos that would have really kind of put the nail in the coffin? What is your answer when they ask questions like that?
You know what? It's interesting that when we find something widely published actually showing that indeed these particular halos form from these particular isotopes, and there's no evidence, of course, to indicate otherwise, lead isotope ratios in the centers and so forth, that indeed they can't explain it. They have no explanation for it. We say it's creation by fiat. They have no explanation for that. So what's the best way to try to divert attention away from the fact that they have to face the music, so to speak? They don't want to face the music. They don't want to say anything about the evidence. So they raise the question of what doesn't exist. In other words,
we could spend all night trying to figure out why God did it this way. Why didn't he do it this other way? Okay, well, why didn't he do it this other way? I mean, you can go on and on and on forever trying to figure out why God didn't do it another way, a way that you think would have been smarter. You're smarter than God. The fact is that why don't you just focus, or why don't we just focus on what exists and try to explain what exists? That's what we're trying to do. And I don't make any apologies, frankly, for supporting that these halos represent a rapid mineral crystallization of the granites. It's just not a hard thing for me to believe in, because I already believe in the Bible. Yeah, that helps a lot if you already have a basis in believing the Bible. If you don't believe in the Bible to begin with, what are you going to do? You're just going to be faced with some tiny piece of evidence that you can't explain any other way. But no matter what, the people that want to say that these polonium halos existed for millions of years as the uranium solutions were feeding these sites don't understand that halos can't even form in a rock that's molten anyway. So you've got so many things going wrong with the theory of trying to hold on to rocks that cool slowly over millions of years that you can't really even make a tenable theory out of it from the beginning. And so, yeah, people a lot of times come up to me and they say, you know what? I just don't understand. I just think that the Earth is really old. Life is young, but the Earth is old. But see, that doesn't make sense in our model either, because if you have the rocks with scientific evidence in the rocks of being crystallized rapidly, what do you do with geologic long ages? Long ages for the framework, the foundations of the Earth. It doesn't fit into the model. So then, these are all things that are going through my mind when people are saying, I just don't have a problem with believing that the Earth is billions of years old. I have a problem with it scientifically, not to mention biblically. We could just talk about the science of why it doesn't make sense to believe that the rocks that form the foundations of the Earth are ancient. It's just that simple. I wish it could be more complex than this, but it's really not. It's a very simple thing that we're talking about here. The way that we disprove that the halos were not formed by secondary, uranium processes, that is complex. But that's why the papers were published. They were published to leave a record that still stands to this day that has not been refuted.
David, what can I say? That's an excellent summary. Let's let the people see the other couple of polonium halos here. This one was started by an isotope of polonium with only that 3-minute half-life. And I want to pick up on what David just said. There are people who continue to say, well, no, they're not really primordial, made in the beginning and so forth. And so over 30 years ago, I published to the entire scientific community. I challenged them. I simply said, if you don't believe that these halos indeed were formed by God supernaturally, the only option is they had to form naturally. You have all the ingredients to go back and try to form these halos in the granites to reproduce them. I've challenged them over and over and over again for 30 years to say, if you don't believe this evidence for creation is really of God, then you should be able to reproduce it. Oh, no. They don't want to hear that. You will never find the evolutionists even mentioning the fact that they fail to actually do the very fundamental thing that science requires. If they believe a theory, and they have all the material, of course, to try to duplicate it, they should be able to do it. We're going to get into that a little bit later on, more specifically, so you'll have a better idea. Right now, as David has pointed out so clearly here, we're saying that these halos are primordial. Now, whatever, in other words, this little illustration right here, at the top we have a glass of water, we put in Alka-Seltzer, and after a minute or so, it's gone, okay? But down at the bottom, you put in the Alka-Seltzer, and if you instantly freeze the water when the bubbles are coming out, then of course the bubbles are going to be in the glass. And also the bubbles are going to be there after 100 years. In other words, for the actual radioactive particles to shoot out and have a record there in the granite rock, it has to be what? Formed simultaneously with the injection of the radioactivity in the rock. It's simply bing, 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 bing. And it's all along. Now look at this next slide. What is it? Good old El Capitan again. We're saying that these halos are in El Capitan. And so we go from there to, David?
Again,
what are the implications?
We're going back to what the Bible says, that the word of the Lord was used to speak the earth into existence. All the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake and it was done, he commanded and it stood forth. And there's really no other way to say it.
And he actually then decided for us living here today and for those in the last days who are in any way doubting the Genesis record of creation in Psalm 33, 6 and 9, he left something here to affirm scientifically what he said. That's all there is to it. Back in 1981, after I had been at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory for over 10 years as a guest scientist, publishing papers on what we're talking about tonight, bringing out to the scientific community the evidence for creation, and virtually getting no refutation, the laboratory was letting me remain year after year and year after year because I was publishing these papers. Not because I was publishing the papers per se, but because the papers were being published and the personnel at the laboratory could see there was no refutation. They could see these articles were being published in the world's esteemed scientific journals, and there were no evolutionists that were being able to shoot the evidence down. So I went to this trial, and over here on the left-hand corner you can see the people who came to the trial, the scientists who came to the trial for the evolutionist position, and on the right, the scientists who came to the trial for creation. What happened is, earlier, in the early part of 1981, the state of Arkansas had passed a law requiring the teaching of creation science in the public schools. The ACLU challenged that law, and I was asked to come and testify about the scientific evidence that I had been publishing. Well, my wife and I prayed about it, and if something happened to indicate that's exactly what I should do. I should go and testify. I realized, however, that in doing this, it was going to go out not just to the scientific community now, it was going out to the world. And I had a pretty good idea that the laboratory management was going to take a very dim view because throughout the scientific community, they had, in a sense, tolerated me being there at that laboratory saying all these things about the evidence showing that indeed the earth was formed very, very rapidly, that it's very, very young. This is something that doesn't exist. A scientist came over from Germany one day and came up to talk to me, and as a result of that, he went back and talked to the chemistry division director. I was in the chemistry division. He went back and told the chemistry division director after he talked to me. He said, you know, if Gentry lived in Russia, he was a German scientist, well known. He said, if Gentry lived in Russia, this is now about 1979 or thereabouts, 78, he would be shot. In other words, if a man such as myself were to go and try to find and publish something in Russia at that particular time, he was saying to the chemistry division director, I would be shot. He said in Germany, if he were over here doing the work here in Germany, which, I'm the head of a big laboratory myself, if he were here in Germany, he would starve. In other words, nobody, he would not support my work, no one would support my work, regardless of these reports. He said, only here in America, with you, being the chemistry division director, is Gentry able to do the work that he's done and get these papers published. I know what the answer was for me being able to stay there that long. That was the God of heaven intervening to help me use the marvelous facilities of the laboratory and the friendship of the people of the laboratory for a long period of time to get these results out to the world. Well, what happened here at the Arkansas Creation Trial? It turns out, I'll mark here on the screen, the gentleman, Brent Dalrymple, who was there to testify for an ancient age of the earth. He was one of the world's eminent geologists. He was there to testify and to affirm, ancient earth, so therefore evolution of the earth, evolution of life had to have happened. And that's exactly what he did. And yours truly, of course, at that particular time, I'm down here on the lower right. You can see I'm flashing the light up there. That's where I was, and along with several others who came to testify for creation. But remember we said that Brent Dalrymple was an eminent scientist? David, what happened there in March 2005?
In 2005, we see that Brent Dalrymple was given a National Medal of Science from President Bush. And the reason we show this slide is basically just to try to show people that Brent Dalrymple was somebody that, had made a lot of contributions to science and was recognized by President Bush with this medal. But in the process of making these contributions to science, he also wrote some letters which were used. Are they going to be showing next here?
We'll be showing those later on. Then.
He wrote some letters. We're going to be seeing some of those letters in a minute that actually give an indication of what he feels like is wrong with the Genesis movement, as he calls it.
But right now at the trial, Brent Dalrymple was testifying. Now this is what the judge, the Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General David Williams, Brent Dalrymple was on the witness stand. And he was, for example, like right here. And the judge, Overton, was right here. And he was being cross-examined by David Williams, who was standing almost 5 or 10 feet from Brent Dalrymple, who was sitting in the witness stand. And he was going through a series of questions of Brent Dalrymple, trying to find out exactly more. Brent Dalrymple had already testified about the ancient age of the earth and on and on and on. In fact, he said that people who believed in creation and the young age of the earth were, guess what? They were like flat earthers. In other words, they were really off track. But the Assistant Attorney General, David Williams, got around to asking him about my work. And he said, Dr. Dalrymple, what about Robert Gentry's work? And this is what he had to say. On the witness stand there with a full course of the audience and the judge listening, and also it's in record of the trial itself, and it's copied there in my book if you're ever interested in reading. Go ahead.
Right, it's part of the trial transcript. But basically, Brent Dalrymple's explanation of the polonium halo research, he states this. He says, also in Gentry's work, he proposed a very tiny mystery, which is balanced on the other side by an enormous amount of evidence. Notice this similarity between what the National Academy of Sciences said in its booklet, Science and Creationism, or Frank Press's letter response to Dad, where he says, I don't see how one piece of data can balance the overwhelming information on the other side. And here, Brent Dalrymple is saying the exact same thing. A tiny mystery balanced on the other side by an enormous amount of evidence, but he does think it's important to know what the answer to that little mystery is. And for most people, I'll just tell you this, most people, the answer to that little mystery is simple. It was formed by some uranium precursor which has, millions of year half-life. That's their answer. That's the only answer they can come up with. And that answer was refuted by the published papers. But anyway, the rest of his thing, he says, he's trying to explain now exactly what is this little mystery. He says, if you have a granitic body, a rock that comes from the melt, that contains this mica. And it cools down. It takes millions of years like that for a body to cool, so that by the time the body cooled, the body of rock is what he's referring to here, all the polonium would have decayed. What happened to the Alka-Seltzer tablet a minute after it was put in the glass? It decays away. All the activity from the tablet is gone. Once it's gone, can you capture the activity of the tablet fizzing in the water? No. Once it's gone, it's gone. The same thing with the polonium halos, so that by the time the body cooled, all the polonium would have decayed, since it has an extremely short half-life of the order of minutes. Therefore, there would be no polonium in the body to cause the polonium halos. So what Gentry is saying, this is primordial polonium. In other words, primordial polonium, not polonium derived from uranium. And that was the subject of all these papers. Therefore, the granite mass in which it occurs could not have cooled slowly. Therefore, it must have been created by fiat instantly. You know, the essence of what really is behind the research on the polonium halos is not that difficult to grasp. What's difficult to grasp is what follows in train if you accept that scientific evidence. And that is basically you can no longer have long ages. You can't have your long ages for the rocks to form. You can't even have your long ages prior to the formation of life. You can't have it. And you know, it kind of makes common sense a little bit, because if you really believe that the 6 days of creation are literally occurred like they are stated in the Bible, it's not hard to accept the fact that God on day one of creation week spoke the earth into existence. Just like on day 4 of creation week, God created the lesser light and the greater light. Oh yeah, he made the stars too. So if you really want to believe that the earth is billions of years old, you've got to also believe that the sun and the moon and the solar system are billions of years old. But that all flies in the face to the plain word of the Bible. To say then that, well, somehow there was a shroud, which was covering the moon and covering the sun, takes away from the literal wording of the verse when it says he made 2 great lights, the lesser light to rule the night, the greater light to rule the day. You can also go into the Greek and try to look at the origins of the words, but to me, it makes sense in English. I mean, I can read it in English and I can figure out what's going on. I can read the 4th commandment in English, and it says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Revelation 14, worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. It's very simple. God wants to draw our attention to the fact that he is the creator. If we take away any of that, we're diluting what the plain word of the Bible is saying, period. Why do we want to do that?
David, let's ask this question. This man is an eminent geologist, world-renowned and so forth, and there he is testifying that, and there's a room full of reporters and everything. It got some coverage, but for all practical purposes, the people who were there, the writers and so forth, the reporters who were there, minimized the fact that indeed this evidence was being presented there. Something in the rock that formed very, very quickly. You had to have something around it to catch the radiation instantaneously, or else you don't get anything. And yet the reporters that were there, with few exceptions, said almost nothing about this evidence. Now, here it is. For example, see, the evolutionary view is simply that indeed you've got the granite foundation, you've got a molten earth and so forth, and so the granites are forming deep in the earth and slowly cooling. But what we've just seen is a comparison now. Up top, the top part of our schematic up there, is that if we have radioactive decay plus slowly cooling molten granite, then indeed, radioactive decay meaning the rapid radioactive decay, slowly cooling granite, there are no halos. Nothing is going to be caught in the granite because it's all gone long before the rock actually formed into a solid. The second one, the second illustration, radioactive decay, rapid radioactive decay, instantly created cold granite. You know, it's just like a Polaroid. I could be up here tonight with a Polaroid camera, if they're still used these days, and we push the shutter, push the button, of course. The flash flashes light, and indeed it goes to the audience, comes back. Now, the shutter has got to be synchronized with that flash of light so that it opens and closes instantly, or at the same time, synchronized for it to come back and go back to the film. The film now records the object, the image of the light. Now, the film then is like the granite. The granite has to be there in a form so that it can capture the radiation. The radiation itself would be like the flash of light going out and coming back through the open shutter. There has to be a synchronization of the creation of the little tiny speck of radioactivity for that polonium halo has to be there along with the creation of what's around it, the granite rock, has to be done all together, has to be done instantaneously, or it's all over in just a very, very, very short period of time. The very fact of the matter is, the reason why you haven't heard of all this before, for all practical purposes, most of you, is because, look at this. Tested theories, go ahead, David.
Tested theories of science such as mechanics, electromagnetism, optics and light, nuclear physics, and thermodynamics have all had their central assumptions validated experimentally in the laboratory thousands of times. False scientific theories are built upon central assumptions which have never been validated. They can masquerade for decades and even centuries before their falsities discovered. And of course, the perfect example of that is the astronomy of Ptolemy. How many knew from their 8th grade science class that there was once a time in Earth history where everyone, all scientists, anybody that had any interest in astronomy, knew that the Earth was at the center of the solar system, that the sun rotated around the Earth, that all of the planets rotated around the Earth, and built an elaborate mechanism which actually predicted, by the way, it predicted very well the planetary motions which were being observed at that time. For hundreds of years, planetary motion was very accurately predicted by the Ptolemaic model of the solar system, where the sun was rotating around the Earth. Now, don't you think that's interesting that such an obvious mistake could be believed and rebelieved and taught for hundreds of years until finally somebody came along called Copernicus and said, you know what? There's a more elegant model which also fits the data. And that more elegant model has the sun at the center of the solar system and the Earth rotating around the sun. Now that actually got him in hot water with what?
With the church, of all things, at that particular time. Let us emphasize what David is saying here. What we're basically saying here, we said the difference between true and false scientific theories is that the true will have its central assumption tested and validated, but the false ones, it can masquerade for a long, long period of time. If you don't test the central assumption here, as David has said, was that indeed the Earth was at the center and everything was revolving around, and so an explanation. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of observations were put in to support this Ptolemaic astronomy of the Earth being the center of the planetary system. But it was wrong, and the only reason it was found to be wrong is because Copernicus came along and he found that indeed the explanations of the planetary motion fit the sun being at the center and planetary motion then occurring around the sun, which we all believe. So what we're coming around to basically is saying that indeed one of the theories, so to speak, we want to call that scientifically, one of the theories we're talking about tonight, evolution, has never had its fundamental central assumption tested. And as a result of that, all sorts of erroneous predictions, so to speak, have occurred. Many apparently good predictions have been fulfilled, people have focused on the good predictions that have been filled and to say evolution has got to be true because we see this observation, this observation, this observation, it all fits evolution, so therefore it's got to be true. Well, the very fact of the matter is there are observations, which we'll bring to you tonight, that will show indeed fantastic contradictions, which we've already been talking about in part, the polonium halos, evidence of Earth's rapid creation that will never ever fit the long age of granite cooling. The question, David?
Which of the two has been masquerading as the scientific truth?
Now, when we say which of the two, we mean, is it creation or evolution? Which of these two has been masquerading? Go ahead.
Which of the two fits evolution? Which of the two fits creation? And what part do primordial polonium halos act in deciding the scientific answer?
We're back to this primordial decay of primordial polonium as being something that affirms very, very clearly the fact that the polonium halo, something you can see visually in the microscope, was produced by something that just existed for a short period of time and disappeared, and yet there's an indelible record of it there in the rocks. And that is one of the polonium halos that occur in granites all over the world. So it's something that's a worldwide nature. It's something that David and I believe that indeed was created by God to help people to understand that when God said in the Bible, He spoke. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of His mouth, for He spake and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. Every word in the Bible is true. Even the creation account given in Genesis, which we're going to have more on tomorrow evening. Thank you so much.